Chapter 5, Bullet 399, Magic or Real. In the first hours following President Kennedy's murder, confusion was endemic. It spread from Dallas to Washington and on to Europe, from Parkland Hospital and the Dallas police station to newspapers, radio, and television like an airborne plague. No one was prepared for that awful convulsion of history. In it, some men made mistakes which added to the confusion. These, in turn, prepared the ground for an assault 3 years later on the findings of the Warren Commission, which wasn't appointed until a week after Kennedy died. Apparently, on the theory that any sign of confusion or bungling by anyone in Dallas on November 22, 1963, undermines the Commission report, critics of the Commission have blasted away at almost everything the police, doctors, and newsmen said or did in Dallas on that day. Like the hunter who wants to be sure of hitting something, most of them have fired with shotguns. They have brought down random targets which in no way disprove any of the Commission's conclusions. A few examples. Charge. Police at first identified the murder weapon found in the depository as a 7.65 caliber German Mauser, then changed their story and said it was an Italian-made 6.5 caliber Mannlicher Carcano. Answer: true. The officer who made the faulty identification was one of Lane's favorite witnesses, Constable Seymour Weitzman, who once sold sporting goods, but admitted to the Commission he made the identification at a glance. He was also wrong on his identification of the Japanese-made telescopic gun sight. Comment: no one, not even Lane, has ever advanced a reason why, if the police were going to plant a rifle to incriminate Oswald, they would plant a Mauser and then say it was a Mannlicher Carcano. Charge. Police falsely reported finding a map marked with the route of the presidential motorcade in Oswald's room in Beckley Avenue. Answer: true. It was a map he had used in job hunting with the book depository marked. Comment: it had no more relevance to his guilt or innocence than another false story put out by the police, that he had munched a chicken lunch just before the assassination. The chicken bones were left there by another employee. Charge. Oswald's civil rights were violated. Probably true. Dallas police searched his part-time home in suburban Irving out of their jurisdiction without a warrant. There is little evidence to suggest they exerted themselves to get him a lawyer of his choice during the 45.5 hours they held him prisoner. Under present U.S. Supreme Court rulings, pre-trial publicity virtually precluded him a fair trial. Comment: his murder by Ruby had rendered his opportunity for any trial moot by the time the Commission met. As a fact-finding body not trying Oswald for murder, the Commission was able to take evidence that might have been inadmissible in court, but which shed invaluable light on the case. But of all the aspects of the Kennedy assassination that have attracted the fire of Warren Report critics, none is more popular as a target than the single bullet theory, the Warren Commission's unprovable theory that one bullet fired from Oswald's rifle, later to become Exhibit 399, tore through President Kennedy's neck, ripped through Governor Connolly's back, fracturing a rib, came out of his chest under his right nipple, shattered his right wrist, then lodged in his left thigh, fell out of that wound, and was found later at Parkland Hospital. According to the theory, Bullet 399 was the first to hit an occupant of the president's car. One shot went wild, another struck the president in the head and fragmented. What makes the theory unacceptable to the critics is the fact that the bullet which the Commission says did all this damage, Lane calls it the magic bullet, was recovered in remarkably good shape. Its nose was hardly blunted, almost not at all, and it had lost little weight in its remarkable flight. A normal copper-jacketed slug for a 6.5 millimeter rifle weighs 160 to 161 grains. When found at Parkland Hospital after falling off Governor Connolly's emergency cart, according to the Commission, Exhibit 399 weighed a fat 158.6 grains. The commission adopted the single bullet theory only after lively debate behind closed doors. Assistant counsel Arlen Specter, who evolved the theory, argued that it was the only way to explain how Kennedy and Connally could have been hit in such a short space of time. The Zapruder film showed that they were hit or at least reacted visibly to their wounds within 1.8 seconds. The commission had already accepted 2.3 seconds as the minimum time in which Oswald's bolt-action rifle could get off 2 rounds. Thus, the single bullet theory seemed desirable, if not necessary, to support the single assassin concept. Nevertheless, because of the almost pristine condition of the bullet, and because Connally testified it was inconceivable he was hit by the same bullet that pierced Kennedy's throat, some members of the commission balked at adopting Specter's hypothesis as a finding or conclusion. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, Senator John Sherman Cooper of Kentucky, and Representative Hale Boggs of Louisiana were skeptical. Former CIA Chief Allen Dulles, Representative Gerald Ford of Michigan, and John McCloy, former president of the World Bank, thought it reasonable. Chief Justice Warren wanted a unanimous report. In what McCloy later described as a battle of the adjectives, Ford suggested that the evidence for the single bullet theory should be called compelling. Russell thought the commission should say only that it was credible. McCloy finally suggested the word persuasive as a compromise. The commission then concluded, although it is not necessary to any essential findings of the commission to determine just which shot hit Governor Connally, there is very persuasive evidence from the experts to indicate that the same bullet which pierced the president's throat also caused Governor Connally's wounds. A study of that evidence from the experts is indeed very persuasive that Kennedy's neck wound and all of Connally's wounds were caused by bullet 399. A study of the arguments against the single bullet theory reveals again that the critics of the commission departed from logic and resorted to trickery, this time to prove their preconceived notion that those wounds were inflicted in some other undefined way. For example, in a final effort to prove that the bullet, which struck Kennedy's back, never left his body and thus couldn't have slammed into Connally, Epstein says, the fact that the autopsy surgeons were not able to find a path for the bullet is further evidence that the bullet did not pass completely through the president's body. The fact is, the autopsy surgeons did find a path for the bullet, as well as a point of exit. Dr. Humes, the chief autopsy surgeon, testified before the commission that early in the examination, the doctors were unable to take probes and have them satisfactorily fall through at this point. Epstein evidently stopped reading there. They hesitated to probe further for fear of making a false passage, Dr. Humes explained. But, he testified 2 pages farther along in the hearings on dissection, they found that in the apex of the right pleural cavity there was a bruise or contusion or exmimosis of the parietal pleura, as well as a bruise of the upper portion, the most apical portion of the right lung. By the color and condition of the damaged tissue, they concluded that these bruises marked the path of a bullet through the neck rather than any damage caused by the tracheotomy. So we feel, Dr. Humes testified, that had this missile not made its path in that fashion, the wound made by Dr. Perry in the neck, the tracheotomy, would not have been able to produce these contusions in the musculature of the neck. Both Lane and Epstein argue next that the bullet found at Parkland could not have inflicted the damage it did on Kennedy and Connally and come out so undeformed. They imply that more metal was found or left in Connally's wounds than was missing from bullet 399. Here, they both employ tunnel vision, seeing just what they wanted to see in the record while ignoring the testimony the commission finally found persuasive. They invoke as witnesses Dr. Humes and Dr. Fink, who performed the autopsy on Kennedy but did not see Connally's wounds. Both expressed the opinion that the bullet which went through Kennedy's neck could have gone through Connally's body, but doubted that it could have then shattered the governor's wrist and embedded in his thigh with so little loss of weight. Dr. Humes thought it extremely unlikely because reports he had read from Parkland told of metal fragments in Connolly's wrist and thigh bone. I can't conceive of where they came from, this missile, he added, referring to bullet 399. Dr. Fink took the same position because there were too many fragments described in reports from Parkland in that wrist. If this was the opinion of the doctors at Bethesda who read about Connolly's wounds, what about the doctors at Parkland who actually attended the wounded governor? The commission called 3 of them, and each independently expressed his opinion that the same bullet that traversed Connolly's body also caused the wrist and thigh wounds. Dr. Robert Shaw, the thoracic surgeon who treated Connolly's chest, told the commission, I have always felt that the wounds of Governor Connolly could be explained by the passage of one missile through his chest, striking his wrist, and a fragment of it going into his left thigh. I had never entertained the idea that he had been struck by a second missile. He added a minute later that he thought it perfectly possible for the first bullet to have passed through the soft tissues of the neck of President Kennedy and produced the wounds that we found on Governor Connolly. Dr. Charles Gregory, an orthopedic surgeon who handled the wrist wound, concurred. As a doctor who had treated some 500 gunshot wounds, he added 2 convincing details. Number 1, the bullet which struck the governor's wrist carried some debris from his chest, and number 2, if it had struck his wrist without first going through another object, it would have been likely to blow it very nearly off. Dr. George T. Shires, a surgeon who was called in from Galveston after Connolly was shot and who arrived in time to treat his thigh wound, testified that he and every Parkland doctor consulted on the case thought all of Connolly's wounds were caused by the same bullet. As for the reported metal fragments in Connolly's wounds, which caused Doctors Humes and Fink at Bethesda to doubt that bullet 399 could have inflicted so many wounds and remained intact, Dr. Gregory testified that on the basis of the metal left behind in Governor Connolly's body, as far as I could tell, the missile that struck it could be virtually intact. The amount of metal in Connolly's wounds, he said, was very small, very small. The only measurable recovered fragment weighed only 1/2 grain. The fact that so little metal and no bullet was found in Connolly's body, he added, prompted him to suggest a search of the governor's clothing or perhaps in the auto or someplace for a missing bullet. Not one word of this testimony in substantiation of the single bullet and single assassin theory appears either in Epstein's or Lane's book. What is worse, Epstein blandly and shamelessly asserts that the other medical witnesses agreed with this, Dr. Fink's conclusion. To accommodate their preconceptions, they choose to cite only the testimony of 2 doctors who never saw Connolly's wounds and, ironically, whose autopsy report on Kennedy they attacked as fraudulent. Predictably, they also give short shrift to 3 Army wound ballistic experts, a veterinarian, a physiologist, and a pathologist, who told of experiments firing Oswald's rifle into goats and human cadavers, which supported the single bullet theory. The tests were conducted at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland with Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano rifle and Western Cartridge Company bullets identical to bullet 399. One of the first experiments proved this bullet to have terrific penetrating ability, far greater than the M80 NATO round used by U.S. troops in Europe. With shaved animal skin, animal meats, and gelatin, and clothing similar to that worn by the president, the Army scientists then simulated the portion of Kennedy's neck through which the bullet passed. A bullet fired from 180 feet maintained most of the velocity and stability in passing through the mock-up and left an exit wound only slightly different from the entry hole. A shot fired into a goat produced on X-ray examination a fracture of its 8th rib almost identical to the fracture of Connolly's 5th rib and with little mutilation of the bullet. Other tests demonstrated that the bullet which wounded Connolly's wrists and thigh must have lost considerable velocity, probably in passing through the president's neck and the governor's chest. Otherwise, both the wrist and the bullet would have been damaged more. Questioned by Assistant Counsel Spector Dr. Frederick W. Light, Jr., a pathologist with a Ph.D. in mathematics, concluded that a single bullet probably caused Kennedy's neck wound and all of Connolly's wounds. Spector: You think that is the most likely possibility? Dr. Light: I think that is probably the most likely, but I base that not entirely on the anatomical findings, but as much on the circumstances. Spector: What are the circumstances which lead you to that conclusion? Dr. Light: The relative positions in the automobile of the president and the governor. Spector: Are there any other circumstances which contribute to that conclusion other than the anatomical findings? Dr. Light: And the appearance of the bullet that was found and the place it was found, presumably the bullet was the one which wounded the governor. Spector: The whole bullet? Dr. Light: The whole bullet. Spector: Identified as Commission Exhibit 399. Dr. Light: Yes. Clearly, the pattern of the Warren Report critics is, if the experts agree with you, use them. If they don't, ignore them. Similarly, where there is no evidence to explain their theories, they offer no explanations. For example, in postulating that Kennedy's neck wound and Connolly's wounds were inflicted by separate bullets, not by bullet 399 alone, Epstein neglects to say what he thinks happened to the other bullet. Doctors and FBI experts testified that the bullet which passed through the soft tissues of Kennedy's throat would have lost so little of its velocity that it would have caused considerable damage somewhere in the car had it not hit Connolly, seated directly in front of the president. FBI agent Robert A. Frazier testified it would have penetrated and shattered the windshield, embedded deeply in the upholstery, or, had it hit the windshield frame, torn a hole in the chrome, penetrating the framing both inside and outside the car. Yet there was no bullet or bullet hole in the car, only a few fragments of the bullet that ripped open the president's head a moment later. The Warren Commission report says inaccurately that it was found on Governor Connolly's stretcher at Parkland Hospital after the assassination. But this misstatement or oversimplification by the Commission is as nothing compared to the violence done to the facts by the Commission's critics. In his book, Epstein, after accepting Dr. Fink's opinion that bullet 399 was too hefty to have caused Connolly's wrist wound, makes a flat assertion that the bullet found on the stretcher thus could not have been the bullet that caused all of Connolly's wounds. Lane, with unaccustomed restraint, does not say that. He insists there is not sufficient evidence that bullet 399 caused Connolly's wounds or was found on his stretcher. Then he hints that the bullet was planted in order to link Oswald to a crime he didn't commit. And finally, to cover all bases, he puts the bullet on Kennedy's stretcher. There appears to be absolute proof, he says, ignoring the autopsy, that the autopsy revealed that the bullet which entered the president's back did not pass through his body, but rather fell out on his stretcher. Weisberg, in his whitewash, suggests it was planted. There was evidence that, on several occasions and for some time, the stretcher was unattended and accessible to anyone wandering through the hospital. What are the facts? Seconds after Governor Connolly was wheeled into Trauma Room 2 on a metal four-wheeled rubber-tired emergency cart, he was stripped of his clothing by two nurses. His clothes were put in a paper sack at the foot of the cart. Through a mix-up, the bag later wound up in a closet in the Washington office of Representative Henry Gonzalez. No doctor or nurse saw a bullet. Minutes later, he was wheeled out down a corridor through obstetrics and gynecology, then placed on an elevator to go to surgery. On the second floor, he was wheeled down another corridor to operating room 5, where an orderly helped move him from the cart onto an operating table. A nurse rolled the two bloody sheets on the cart into a small bundle and left them There was some hypodermic needles, an alcohol sponge, and a roll of 1-inch tape. An orderly then pushed the cart back onto the emergency elevator to be returned to the ground floor emergency area. The second floor orderly testified the Connolly cart was the only one placed on the elevator during his shift. Darrell C. Tomlinson, the hospital's senior engineer, found the cart on the elevator at 1 p.m., about the time Kennedy died, when he came to operate it during the Kennedy-Connolly emergency. As he pushed the cart, which the commission labeled Cart A, off the elevator against a wall in the corridor, he saw another identical stretcher, Cart B, parked a few feet away. He made at least one trip on the emergency elevator with a doctor going for some blood, then returned to find that one of the carts had been moved by another doctor going to the men's room. When he pushed the cart back against the wall, bullet 399 clattered out onto the floor. As Tomlinson tried to describe his experience under questioning by Arlen Specter, he got confused. And that bullet was from that stretcher? I believe that it was B. Specter. And what was on B, if you recall, if anything? Tomlinson. Well, at one end, they had 1 or 2 sheets rolled up. I didn't examine them. They were bloody. They were rolled up on the east end of it, and there were a few surgical instruments on the opposite end, and a sterile pack or so. Obviously unnerved by the fact that Tomlinson had testified the bullet came from a cart other than Connolly's, Specter pressed him. Specter, now, Mr. Tomlinson, are you sure that it was stretcher A that you took off the elevator and not stretcher B? Tomlinson, well, really, I can't be positive. Just to be perfectly honest about it, I can't be positive because I really didn't pay much attention to it. The stretcher was on the elevator and I pushed it off of there, and I believe we made 1 or 2 calls up before I straightened out the stretcher against the wall. Doubters have made much of this lapse of memory by Tomlinson. The commission cannot know whence the bullet materialized or if it had fallen off the governor's stretcher, for Tomlinson, the only source of the commission's information, himself possessed no such certain knowledge, says Lane. But the commission was apparently impressed that Tomlinson remembered seeing 2 bloody rolled-up sheets on the cart which yielded bullet 399. Undoubtedly the sheets rolled into a small bundle by the nurse upstairs and left on Connolly's cart, the only emergency cart taken down from surgery that afternoon. Kennedy's cart, several witnesses testified, was pushed across the hall into Trauma Room 2 after Connolly was removed, and thus could not have dropped a bullet in the corridor near the elevator. On this evidence, the commission concluded that bullet 399 had come from Connolly, thus nailing down the last step of the eventful journey Specter hypothesized for it, and all but adopting outright the single bullet theory. There was no physical evidence, it should be noted, to support any other theory. The last resort of the doubters of the single bullet theory is eyewitness testimony, and their favorite eyewitness is Governor Connolly, who rode on the jump seat just ahead of Kennedy. This is ironic in view of the fact that Connolly is satisfied beyond all doubt Oswald did all the shooting, but nevertheless, Connolly's testimony before the commission is the delight of the two-gun theorists. His insistence that he was hit by a bullet other than the one which went through Kennedy's neck also appeared to be the moving force behind Life magazine's decision on the 3rd anniversary of the assassination to call for a reopening of the investigation. Life made its demand the same week its sister publication, Time, declared that there seems little valid excuse for another inquiry. The burden of Connolly's testimony before the Warren Commission was that he was hit in the back after Kennedy was hit in the neck, but before the fatal bullet to the president's head. Here is the story he told the commission. We had just made the turn into Elm Street when I heard what I thought was a shot. I heard this noise, which I immediately took to be a rifle shot. I instinctively turned to my right because the sound appeared to come from over my right shoulder. So I turned to look back over my right shoulder, and I saw nothing unusual except just people in the crowd, but I did not catch the president in the corner of my eye. And I was interested because once I heard the shot in my own mind, I identified it as a rifle shot, and I immediately, the only thought that crossed my mind was that this is an assassination attempt. So I looked. Failing to see him, I was turning back to look back over my left shoulder into the back seat, but I never got that far in my turn. I got about in the position as I am in now facing you, looking a little bit to the left of center, and then I felt like someone had hit me in the back. Connolly was asked for his best estimate of the time between the shot he heard and the shot that hit him, which he said he did not hear. He continued, "A very, very brief span of time. I immediately thought that I had been shot. I knew it when I just looked down and I was covered with blood. I knew I had been hit, and I immediately assumed, because of the amount of blood, and in fact that it had obviously passed through my chest, that I had probably been fatally hit. So I merely doubled up and then turned to my right again. Immediately I could see on my clothes. I could see on the interior of the car, which, as I recall, was a pale blue, brain tissue, which I immediately recognized, and as I recall very well, on my trousers there was one chunk of brain tissue as big as almost my thumbnail, and again I did not see the president at any time, either after the first, second, or third shots, but I assumed always that it was he who was hit and no one else." When he recounted the story for Life 3 years later in equally vivid detail, I was struck by his assertion that his recollection of that day was still total and precise. I was particularly impressed by his statement that "I know every split second of what happened in that car until I lost consciousness." Because of my interest in Dallas Eyewitnesses, Chapter 1, and as a check against his total, precise recall, I checked further into his testimony before the Commission on April 21st, 1964. There I found that Governor Connolly had estimated the speed of the president's car at the time of the shooting at between 20 and 22 miles an hour. This is about the same estimate I would have made, but the cold eye of the Zapruder camera established it at 11.2 miles an hour. Next, I found he had estimated the time span between the first and third shots at 10 to 12 seconds. Since the Zapruder film indicated a span of 4.8 to 5.6 seconds, this was another error of approximately 100%. I still might have taken seriously the governor's precise recall about being hit by a different bullet if I had not re-encountered this colloquy with Assistant Counsel Spector. "Spector, did you, after the discovery of blood on his shirt, experience any sensation of being struck any place other than which you have described on your chest?" Connolly, "No." "Spector, did you, after the discovery of blood on his shirt, experience any sensation of being struck any place other than that which you have described on your chest?" Connolly, "No." "What other wounds, if any, did you sustain?" Connolly, "A fractured wrist and a wound in the thigh, just above the knee." Spector, "Were you conscious of receiving that wound on the wrist at the time you sustained it?" Connolly, "No, sir, I was not." Spector, "When did you first know you were wounded in the wrist?" Connolly, "When I came to in the hospital on Saturday, the next morning, and I looked up and my arm was tied up in a hospital bed, and I said, 'What is wrong with my arm?' And they told me then that I had a shattered wrist, and that is when I also found out I had a wound in the thigh." At first I blinked in astonishment. Could a man who had no doubt about which bullet struck him and who knew every split second of what happened in the death car possibly have suffered a shattered wrist and a wound in the thigh without knowing it? Or, if he sustained these wounds and didn't know it, is it not possible he was struck by the first bullet that hit the president and didn't realize it? The answer to both questions obviously is yes, and the answer to the riddle of Connolly's testimony, so often cited by Lane, Epstein, and Weisberg, is that his reaction to the bullet that hit him in the back was delayed. In the Zapruder film, Kennedy's first reaction to his neck wound is apparent on frame 225, where his face is obviously distorted with pain and he is starting to clutch at his throat with his right hand. Connolly, according to some viewers, appears unperturbed, but just 5 frames or less than 1/3 of a second later, he is raising his right hand rapidly from his lap. Spector, the author of the single bullet theory, contends that Connolly is already wincing by frame 230 and raising his wounded right wrist in a natural reflex action. Connolly contends that he was not hit until frame 234, where he slumps visibly, with the film running through Zapruder's camera at 1 frame per .055 seconds. This is less than a half a second after Kennedy's first visible reaction. Medical literature and hospital records are crammed with instances of gunshot victims not realizing they were hit for minutes or even hours after sustaining their wounds, or, as Dr. Arthur J. Deisman, an Army physiologist, put it to the commission, some people are struck by bullets and do not even know they are hit.